Good evening. Welcome to Center Place and welcome to our History, Theology, and Philosophy lecture series. We're live streaming this presentation and we will follow it up with a question and answer period as we've been doing all year. And so if you have questions, this is going to be a lot of information tonight. And if you have questions about anything, go ahead and type it into the comments. And Leandro is here as our producer this evening, and he'll take those and share those with me at the end for us to kind of have a discussion. I want to remind everyone that we've been doing these now for 4 or 5 years, and as a result of that, we have a whole host of lectures online, over 130. You can view our entire catalog of lectures broken down by category at our website, centerplace.ca. If you go .ca/lectures, that'll take you right to the lecture library. We also invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, which keeps growing, and we also regularly add new content, and so you'll be updated when that happens. I told you last week about a couple of the upcoming lectures, and those got pushed back for a couple of reasons. So we inserted tonight's lecture, it's a little different, and then also next week's. So next week, I'm going to talk about Christian pacifism and nonviolence. And so we've talked before about things like Christian militancy. So how did a movement that started by a guy who says, love your enemies and blessed are the peacemakers, how did that get to the Crusades and also European imperialism and so forth? With this lecture, we kind of want to look at the pacifist and nonviolence stream that has also existed throughout Christian history, and we'll look at some of the Christian denominations like the Quakers and the Hutterites and so on that have embraced kind of radical nonviolence as part of as central to their identity. One of the reasons we're looking at that is that in our denomination, Community of Christ, this is something that we are pondering as we are pondering how we are called to pursue peace in the world as a denomination. Then we're going to get to that's next week. The week after that, we're going to get to the who was King Herod. So this is part of our lectures on the context of Judea and Galilee at the time of the historical Jesus, as we look at the historical and political background, and we look at the dynasty of the Maccabees and then later the Herodians, and also how that all fits into the Roman administration at the time of Jesus. And then also we'll look after that at the next week about who was Pontius Pilate, again, one of the known historical figures who figures into the life of the historical Jesus. Our lectures are all listener supported. If you'd like to make a contribution in support of these, we really appreciate that. You can again go to our website, centerplace.ca/donate. Thank you so much. Our topic tonight is Schism in Mormonism. This is something I've covered throughout kind of my academic career. My background is one of my backgrounds is as a map maker, and charting the different expressions within the Latter-day Saint movement. Mapping them has been one of the things that I've done for just dozens of Mormon history books and also articles and so on in academic presses and even documentaries and things like that. I was thinking about this again because we have just started watching the new TV series Under the Banner of Heaven, and whenever we do that, kind of like to re-chart out for people, how do all these people like the Laffertys fit into this kind of bigger movement that is more complicated than most people are aware of. So as I mentioned, one of the things I do is I make all kinds of history maps for university presses and things like that in my career, but one of them has been Mormon history. And this is what I call the traditional Mormon history map, and this will figure into even textbooks in a regular history of the United States or something like that, which will essentially show the westward progression of what is generally seen as maybe the most quintessentially American religion, starting in upstate New York and moving progressively west until ultimately Brigham Young and his followers settle the Great Basin and what becomes the state of Utah. But there's a lot that gets left out in a map like this, the traditional Mormon history map, especially, for example, when it's superimposed on a present-day map of the United States as opposed to the time period when it was taking place. So, for example, if we show the political boundaries as of 1844, when Joseph Smith was killed, there was before the partition of the trek here to Utah, but to the point where they're already in Nauvoo. We can see, for example, that when church members moved out to westernmost Missouri, they were not going to the middle of the settled country, but they were actually out on the farthest frontier in the American West. And indeed, when Brigham Young and his followers withdrew from the settled portion of the United States and actually made their pioneer trek to Utah, they were initially attempting to actually escape the United States, and they kind of technically ventured into Mexico, but it was also at a time period that was simultaneous with a war between the U.S. and Mexico, in which the United States actually ended up seizing all of that territory. And so before they actually really got settled, they found themselves back inside U.S. territory again. What is sometimes also overlooked is all of the various details. And so one of the things that people tend to forget is that this time period when the church is established in Kirtland the church is also simultaneously established in Missouri. And in fact, more of the members are in Missouri during this time period. And there's not only one area of settlement since the members are kicked out of Jackson County in Independence. They later are refugees in Clay County, and then they finally are in far west in Caldwell County, a county that is created by the Missouri legislature in order to just for Mormon settlement. Anyway, so there's additional details than the simple progress map that we sometimes see. And there's a lot of details are left out often in terms of the other groups, the other successors. So not everybody followed Brigham Young west. There were, in fact, other leaders who put forward claims, leaders like Lyman White, who established colonies on the Texas frontier, Zodiac, very successful colonies. Likewise, James Strang, who led folks first to Wisconsin and then finally to Beaver Island in Michigan, where again, he established a very successful Mormon colony, and other leaders, went other places. Alphaeus Cutler, who made his way kind of along the pioneer trek, but stayed in Iowa, and Sidney Rigdon, for example, who reorganizes his faction of the church back in Pennsylvania, and so forth. So I want to look a little bit, since Under the Banner of Heaven is what made me kind of think about this topic again, as we've been, like I say, been thinking about it and watching it. The TV show is actually based on John Krakauer's 2003 best-selling crime book of the same name. That book tells the story of the 1984 murders of Brenda Lafferty and her infant daughter, Erica. So Brenda's brother-in-law, Ron Lafferty, considered himself to be a prophet who was receiving revelation, and he claimed to be acting upon the revelation when he and his brother Dan committed the murders. So the murders were particularly gruesome. So Ron and Dan slit the throats of Brenda and her baby. And when they did that, that actually connects their murders to the idea of blood atonement. So what is blood atonement? So Brigham Young and other Utah Mormon leaders in the 19th century taught that certain sins were so grave that they were not covered by the atonement of Christ. And the individual had to atone with their own blood in order to be saved. In other words, they needed to have their blood spilled so they could be executed in order to actually atone for that sin. For example, then, in this teaching in an 1856 sermon, Brigham Young declared, "If you found your brother in bed with your wife and put a javelin through both of them, you would be justified, and that would atone for their sins and be received into the kingdom of God. Under such circumstances, I have no wife for whom I love so well that I would not put a javelin through her heart, and I would do it with clean hands." So in other words, in Brigham Young's teaching, adultery is a capital offense, and if a husband kills his wife, he is fully justified, he's sinless, and indeed he's even helping his wife atone for her sin according to this, very violent formulation and doctrine. So Young's doctrine of blood atonement actually did lead to a number of illegal murders, and most infamously among them is the mass murder of 120 members of the Baker Fancher Immigrant Company, an event known as the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Will Bagley, who's recently deceased, made the case that Young was responsible for these and other killings in his book Blood of the Prophets, which came out just a little bit before, the year before, under the banner of heaven. At the very minimum, we don't know to what extent Brigham Young simply set the tone for the massacre, as opposed to directly, may not have directly ordered it. But in any event, at the very minimum, he is a unindicted conspirator after the fact, as he attempted, very clearly to cover it up and so forth. As with so many doctrines and practices, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the large Mormon church, LDS Church headquartered in Salt Lake, has simply deleted the doctrine of blood atonement without admitting error or apologizing. And so unfortunately, one of the things that happens is when the church has a policy of kind of whitewashing or denying its own history, it leaves it open to schism when its members read actual teachings of former prophets. So if you go to the library and you read all of the old published sermons and so forth of Brigham Young, where the doctrine is still present, and you continue to believe Brigham Young was a prophet, and you don't have any new teaching from the church that they don't teach that now, but they simply deleted it. They don't say Brigham Young was in error. Brigham Young taught racist things, and these racist things are wrong. We apologize for our mistakes. They don't say the church was fully responsible for this massacre, which it was, and we are sorry about that. We shouldn't, and we were wrong. Instead, it deletes it, and so then when people find out about it, and these other doctrines, they sometimes become attracted to them, and that leads them into fundamentalist Mormon churches, for example. So even though the blood atonement doctrine was long deleted, there were oaths of secrecy in the LDS endowment ritual, so practiced in all LDS temples, that included the penalty that rather than reveal the secret of the endowment, the person would rather have, quote, "my throat cut, be cut from ear to ear, and my tongue torn out by its roots." And so although the words of that penalty had been deleted in the early 20th century from the temple ritual, already still though in the 1980s, when the Laffertys are around, when this Under the Banner of Heaven is set, the gestures signifying the penalties that your throat is going to be cut from ear to ear, the way the Lafferty murders took place, were still part of the ceremony anyway, contemporaneously. And so even though some of the things subsequently been deleted, that's been deleted too. But anyway, so the deleting isn't always work. And so if somebody thinks that's part of the their most sacred practice, and then they read what Brigham Young had to say, this can again give them some of these ideas. Anyway, so whether or not that's the case, Krakauer intertwines the story of the Lafferty brothers with Mormon history, beginning with the story of Joseph Smith, following through Brigham Young's Utah Theocracy to the Mountain Meadow Massacre and its aftermath. The LDS position, of course, is that the Lafferty brothers had left the LDS church and can't be considered Mormons. And of course, they had left, and they had started affiliating temporarily with other groups before those groups found them to be too extreme and threw them out too. So the question of that then is, who gets to decide if you're a Mormon or not a Mormon? So the word Mormon is widely associated with what people colloquially call the Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints with its headquarters in Salt Lake. What I call in this presentation, I'll be calling always the LDS Church, because it's too long to say the full name like that. Kind of ironically, anyway, the current LDS president, Russell Nelson, has actually disavowed the word Mormon, so they don't actually, not supposed to call themselves Mormon, and they ask people not to call them Mormon. Nevertheless, they don't necessarily want other people to be called Mormons other than the people in their church, which they also don't call Mormon. So anyway, while this church, which was reorganized by Brigham Young in 1847, it's by far the largest component of the Latter-day Saint movement. The movement actually does extend beyond it in very important ways, and we'll talk about that tonight. So obviously groups rarely want to claim murderers as their own, and so I also don't want to say that by any means the Laffertys are exemplars of fundamentalist Mormonism either. They are, in fact, brutal murderers, and so it's not emblematic of what all the tens of thousands of people that are involved in fundamentalist Mormonism any more than there are the millions of people involved in the LDS Church. The Lafferty family were originally members of the LDS Church. Prior to the murders, Ron and Dan had left the church. They're briefly associated with a small fundamentalist Mormon group, again, totally unaffiliated with the LDS Church, called the School of the Prophets, which is founded and led by, again, a person who identified himself as a prophet, Robert Crossfield. And they were kicked out of that group because of being too extreme and receiving their own revelations and so forth. So they were kind of on their own at that point. So when we try to talk about the word Mormon and who there is as a Mormon, I point out a bunch of times that there's actually more than one kind of Mormon. So Mitt Romney, who's one of the maybe most famous Mormons on the planet, is well known as being from that big church that everybody's aware of, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the LDS Church. Those are the folks with the missionary program when two elders come and knock on your door and so forth. Cody Brown, you might be familiar with from a reality TV show where he and his wives are on reality TV. They are part of a group called the Apostolic United Brethren, or AUB. So whether you know Betty Jessup or just are familiar with kind of this group of polygamous Mormons who are kind of wearing what look like 19th century prairie costumes and have their hair up in all this kind of way. So Betty Jessup is the daughter of a prominent ex-FLDS writer who escaped from the FLDS church, but her daughter chose to go back and return to the church. So she's part of the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or FLDS Church. And a lot of people may be aware that Alice Cooper, while not an active member of any of these, is actually from, he's an ex-member, his father and grandfather were even leaders in a church called the Church of Jesus Christ. And to identify it against other churches, historians sometimes call them the Bickertonites. They don't use that term themselves, but anyway, they use the name Church of Jesus Christ, which sounds like a lot of other names of a lot of other churches. So we just put that in parentheses so we can remember who we're talking about. Okay, so of these groups, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the LDS Church, the Apostolic United Brethren, and the FLDS Church are all part of the Brighamite branch. The Bickertonites are actually from a Rigdonite branch. We'll talk about that. And then of those, though, of the Brighamites, the AUB and the FLDS Church are fundamentalist Mormon sects, the two largest fundamentalist Mormon churches. So we're talking about some of these ite names. And so the Latter-day Saint movement has several major branches. On the one hand, there were a number of schisms that occurred between 1830 and 1844, which is to say during Joseph Smith's own lifetime. But none of those expressions survive. So those churches are all extinct. And then there is a number of major branches that occur during what we call the Mormon succession crisis period from 1844 to the 1860s. And of those, 6 branches have continuing representatives: the Rigdonites, the Strangites, the Brighamites, the Cutlerites, the Josephites, and the Hetrikites. There were other branches that are now extinct that emerged in that time period too. But we'll talk a little bit about some of those, but mostly about the ones that continue. So in doing that, when I make my map here, as we kind of see those various ites and their expressions, I call this my constellation of Mormonism. You see the big church that has so many more members than everybody else, millions of members, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Community of Christ, the main Josephite church with 250,000 members, is the only group in that next size frame that has, in terms of the hundreds of thousands. Then there are groups that have in the 10 to 20,000 range. Those include like the AUB, Temple Lot Church, the Church of Jesus Christ, the Rigdonites. And you can kind of see how those work. So the Brighamites there in the orange, the fundamentalist Mormons, and other, the Josephites around the Community of Christ in green, the Temple Lot Church in that kind of light green, and then Strangites, Cutlerites, and Rigdonites, which are mostly down to one group each. So out of all of that constellation, in terms of using the word Mormon, this is one of the complications of Mormon. So people in the Community of Christ tradition, Josephite tradition, Restorationists, all of those folks do not refer to themselves as Mormons. So if you're in Community of Christ and you're talking about the Mormons, you could possibly be talking about your ancestors. So you could be talking about early Community of Christ history, but more likely you're talking about members of the Utah Church. And that's also true for the usage among the Hetrikites, the Rigdonites, the Cutlerites. More recently, though, as I've said, since 2018, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have also rejected the term Mormon. And so that really leaves the people who self-identify as Mormon as the Strangites. So if you go to Strangite Church in Wisconsin, they'll proudly call themselves Mormons. So they've been Mormons the whole time. And same thing then, fundamentalist Mormons, other Brighamite groups like the AUB, the FLDS Church, they'll call themselves fundamentalist Mormons. And so those are the people who at this point identify as Mormon within the movement. Nevertheless, all of the groups trace their origin to the church organized by Joseph Smith Jr. on April 6, 1830, and to the Book of Mormon, published that same year. From that very beginning, the movement has a number of tensions within it, and this explains why, in fact, there are a number of the schisms that happen and the divisions that happen. So one of the tensions is the church believes in continuing, the movement believes in continuing revelation. So there is new revelation from God, whether it is coming in the form of scriptures that are being translated and published, like the Book of Mormon, or revelations that are being directly dictated as occur in the Doctrine and Covenants. Nevertheless, when these new revelations are happening, they are also simultaneously being understood to be the restoration of an ancient order of things. And so the church is called, the movement is called the Restoration, because what this revelation, this new revelation is meaning to do is not to create new things, but rather to restore all of the old ancient things that were lost. But this becomes a tension when, let's say, You restore something in 1830, and then in 1833 you restore something in a totally different way, and then by 1835 you've restored it yet again differently. Which one of those things is the true ancient order of things if it keeps changing, right? Another tension within the movement is it's led from the beginning by a prophet. So Joseph Smith is the prophet of the church in the initial period during his lifetime. Nevertheless, all of the members are also understood to be able to receive personal revelation. And indeed, the church is from the beginning meant to be ruled by common consent of all the members, as everyone together discerns, what God is calling the church to do. And you can immediately see how that could be in tension between what is potentially a movement that is ever concentrating power into what becomes, in many instances, one-man rule, or a church which is, let's say, more democratically understood, where everybody is individually receiving revelation and together are discerning the course. So one of the things that people tend to forget when they're looking back and seeing how different all these different churches are is how different the church was in its earliest time frame. So from 1830 to 1844, this time period of the church in Joseph Smith's lifetime, the church on the one hand is moving geographically. So we saw that with the map, and I'm indicating this also with color. So it goes from New York to headquarters in Kirtland to the headquarters in far west Missouri and Nauvoo. And I also am using color here to track evolving understandings and practices. So the way the church is first practiced in New York, I'm kind of calling here this kind of blue way, that has evolved into something quite different by 1838, a very, let's say, green way of having Mormonism and so forth. We'll talk about what some of the changes are, but the name of the church, everything's changed by the time church has gone from blue to green to the later developments in Nauvoo, kind of yellow Mormonism. And then what's being taught in Nauvoo by Joseph Smith to an intergroup, kind of secret practices that are being publicly denied. So the exterior church is looked at as yellow, but there's actually this orange church on the inside. And in the meantime, that's what's happening at headquarters, that evolution. But the bulk of the members actually don't live in headquarters. There are branches or congregations of the church established throughout the Midwest and the Northeast and later in England and other places. And the branches are always tracking behind. And so they are not as aware of all of the new developments that keep happening in headquarters. Certainly, they're not aware of the secret practices at the end. So I use just the priesthood structure charts I've made here as just an illustration of how rapidly the faith was evolving. So when the church is organized in 1830, if we just look at the little section on the left here, there are 3 priesthood offices: teacher, priest, and elder. Elders at this time are understood to be apostles, and the leaders of the church, Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, are called the first elder and the second elder, but essentially everybody's an elder and all of the elders are apostles, or a teacher or a priest. And so all the men. So the priesthood is limited to men at this point. That's the whole structure of the church, though, as it's organized. They don't even have deacons. However, just a couple years later, in 1833, their understanding of priesthood offices has actually expanded a lot. So we have added deacons as a role. There has also been an idea that the presiding elder of a branch or a congregation is also called a pastor as one of the roles. They've also added financial officers. There is a bishop that's set aside in Kirtland, where church headquarters is. There's a bishop in the church's colony in Missouri, the Bishop of Zion. Those guys are in charge of temporal property as people consecrate or share their property together and make agricultural co-ops. The bishop buys land on behalf of the church for community farms and so forth. And so that's the role there. And there's also evolved an idea that those original church offices are all part of a lesser priesthood, as some of the elders have also received an ordination to a high priesthood. And among that high priesthood, among those people who have been ordained to a high priesthood, are the presidents of the high priesthood, a role that will eventually be called the first presidency, but initially is not. So that's 1833. There's already that much change. But if we take that 1833 structure and contrast it to what the church looks like just 2 years later in 1835, now what had been a lesser priesthood and a high priesthood, that has now definitely been demarcated as two orders of priesthood, distinct orders of priesthood, the Aaronic priesthood and the Melchizedek priesthood. Elder has now been advanced from being part of the lesser priesthood to being part of the Melchizedek priesthood. That office of high priest has now become a distinct office within the Melchizedek priesthood, not simply just what the high priesthood was. And the first presidency are under the name now given to the presidents of the high priesthood. But there's also been additional offices added. And so there is a presiding evangelist patriarch of the church overseeing other evangelist patriarchs. There have been high councils added. So there is a high council and a presidency of the church in Zion, which is to say the church's colony in Missouri. There's also a high council and presiding high council and presidency of the church in Kirtland, the church's headquarters stake. And there is a president and a high council, traveling high council of the 12, who are the also called the 12 apostles, who are the missionary in charge of the missionary work of the church. And the 12 oversee presidents of 70 and a bunch of people who are called to a new office of 70. So you can see, anyway, very, very much more complicated, and that's just within the first 5 years. This is a rapidly evolving faith. Those very complex offices are worked into the distinctive pulpits that are built in Kirtland Temple, which are used as kind of a teaching tools. There's on either side of the sanctuaries in both the lower and the upper courts are Aaronic and Melchizedek pulpits. The Melchizedek pulpits, elder, high priest, high council, first presidency, show that how the priesthood structure works of the church, and the Aaronic pulpit's the same with the deacons, teachers, priests, and bishops. What I think is very interesting is one of the legacies. The pulpits are one of the most distinct things in an otherwise very normal New England-looking church building that is the Kirtland Temple. But the distinct part on the inside, the pulpits, is then built into the outside of the Salt Lake Temple. So the Salt Lake Temple is also meant to look like a castle because of growing ideas of and feelings about being a kingdom, and indeed being a kingdom under siege. But you can also see built into the towers those same tiers of the pulpits. And the Salt Lake Temple also has an assembly room, just like the one in Kirtland, although bigger, with the same idea of the pulpits on either end. So as the structure gets going, it grows organically, and it isn't necessarily set up in such a way where Joseph Smith is thinking about succession. He's not necessarily thinking about a time when the church is going to exist when he's not in it. Instead, he's thinking about running a church as he's alive in it. And so when we look at like what the scriptures have to say, the Doctrine and Covenants has to say about these new leadership groups, the First Presidency, the presiding high council, the council of 12, the presidents of 70, the scripture indicates that they're all equal in authority, which is wonderful in a kind of a egalitarian religious sense, but it's kind of a mess when you are working out an org chart or trying to, let's say the different court councils are competing against each other, both for the running of the church and also then in succession later. In a functional org chart sense, the way these tended to work is that the first presidency is kind of in charge as the lead council, and it is reports to the presiding high council and the Council of 12, both report to the first presidency. And then the presidency of the 70 assists the 12, since it's also in charge of missionary work, but is clearly in any way subordinate to the 12, which is a higher office, seemingly. However, even though that's maybe how the org chart kind of should ideally function, or maybe was meant to function, in a de facto sense, it wasn't how the church, for example, structure was functioning during the Missouri period. And so when the church is headquartered in far west Missouri in 1838, 1839, including during the period of the Mormon-Missouri War, the High Council, the presiding High Council, actually is kind of functioning as the leading body of the church. And so the High Council meets to control the church's budget, to control all of its judicial cases, deciding who gets excommunicated or not, in terms of excommunicating the witnesses to the Book of Mormon and other things, and also to passing legislation and so forth. And so what ends up happening is, when the first presidency wants to budget something, or wants to promulgate a rule or something like that, or excommunicate someone, the first presidency brings that case to the High Council, which is also ultimately makes kind of the decision. It follows what the first presidency wants to do, but in a de facto sense, the actual decision is actually being made by the High Council. It's also the Council of 12 is functionally subordinate to the High Council, because, for example, when vacancies occur in the Council of 12 Apostles, it's actually the High Council that fills vacancies in the 12, indicating, anyway, at least a de facto subordination, and then the presidency of 70 then also subordinate. So that's kind of how it was functioning in Missouri. That did change by the time the church is ending this early period of development in Nauvoo. So at the time of how it functions in the very end of Joseph Smith's life, the first presidency, again, is kind of overseeing the presiding High Council and the Council of 12, which now have very distinct authority. So the High Council has authority over church headquarters and all the places where there is an organized stake. So if there's an organized stake in New Orleans, then there's a stake High Council there. The stake High Council is in charge of what's going on in the New Orleans stake area. If there is a problem, they can appeal that to the presiding High Council at church headquarters in Nauvoo. Likewise, the Council of 12 Apostles and their assistants in the presidents of 70 are in charge of the mission field. So anywhere where there is not an organized stake. And so, for example, where there are the local individual congregations or branches and they have a problem, they appeal their question to the 12, which has essentially authority over the mission field. So you can kind of see that's kind of the structure of the church that had emerged by the time we're going to get to the succession crisis. So one last thing that muddles the situation in 1844, time of Joseph Smith's death, is that there are multiple layers of restoration. So we've talked about all of those priesthood offices. Actually, that office of elder and teacher and priest, those existed before the church is organized. They've already been baptizing people and ordaining people elders and so forth, because Joseph Smith has restored the priesthood in 1829. It's only in 1830 that the church is restored. So the priesthood pre-exists the church. And then finally, in the last years of his life, there's the restoration of what's called the kingdom. And so this gives one last confusing layer of the restoration at the end of Joseph Smith's life. So Joseph Smith organizes a council of 50, a secret council called the Constitution of the Kingdom. It included a couple non-members who are token non-members to imply that it has supposed to be the Council of the Kingdom has control over the temporal affairs of the world, not just the church. When Joseph Smith orders the destruction of the opposition newspaper in Nauvoo, the Nauvoo Expositor, what he may have been reacting to is the fact that they were going to publish secrets from the Council of 50 indicating that there had been leaks. Somebody in the secret council was sharing what they were doing. They were sharing the fact that they have ordained Joseph Smith to be king of the kingdom of God on earth, possibly in a treasonous act, and that's possibly anyway going to be leaked and published. And so he destroys the newspaper before that could be printed. 4 days, less than a month after the organization of the kingdom, Joseph Smith urged listeners to finish the Nauvoo temple so they could participate in new ritual ordinances as kings and priests unto the Most High God. 4 days later, the Council of 50 received Joseph as prophet, priest, and king, like I say, proclaiming him to be king of the kingdom of God on earth. There are oaths of secrecy in the Council of 50 that were influenced by contemporary Freemasonry practices. So the members of the 50 participated in rituals said to impart keys to the kingdom of God. And so one of the things we should point out, though, is that the kingdom here is actually not the church. So there's a later succession claim that are made by the apostles in their faction that their quorum had been invested with certain keys to the kingdom. But actually, the keys they were invested to are to the kingdom, not to the church. So it has nothing related to the church succession claims. And it wasn't to the apostles, but actually to members of the 50. Brigham Young later convoked his own Council of 50, but his successors essentially dispensed with the kingdom. The kingdom mostly continued. There's some continuance of it in the Cutlerite tradition, and there's been some revivals in some of the Brighamite fundamentalist churches. There were some Strangite practices up until the 1960s, but they're not really doing it anymore. One last big issue that figures into the succession crisis is how hierarchy and ordination works. So we talked about how the initial priesthood offices were elder, and elders are able to ordain people to be priests and teachers and deacons. And you can have a prophet ordain an apostle, and an apostle ordain a high priest ordain an elder. But if you were in a congregation that had no elders, the question is could a teacher ordain somebody to be an elder? And normal restoration understanding, the answer is no. The teacher doesn't have the authority to ordain new elders just because there are no elders. And so if you are at a church when the prophet dies, can somebody who is lower rank and an apostle ordain someone to be a prophet? Some of the branches have said no, but it is a problem since there's only one prophet. So ordaining a new one can be a little bit of a trouble if you're looking at it from this perspective. Whenever a movement happened, so we talked about here the geographical movement of the church, and I'm also using the same colors, the blue New York church, the evolving green, and finally yellow and interior orange churches in Kirtland, Missouri, Nauvoo. Also, whenever there's a collapse, so for example, the collapse of the church in Kirtland, that causes a major schism where people continue to be members in Kirtland, but members of now churches that are not aligned with Joseph Smith, they expel Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon. Likewise, when Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon go to Missouri, they expel the leaders of the Missouri church there. And later, when they're kicked out of Missouri, that causes additional schism. And then, of course, the major moment of schism happens when Joseph Smith himself is killed in 1844. So when that's happening, there are already divisions within the Nauvoo era church. So this is kind of a schematic map of the church with its heart at Nauvoo. And if we're looking again at, there are some of these members that have located to Nauvoo who are members from the earliest times. And so they may remember and they may have come in with this kind of blue church belief. More recent converts, kind of these green church beliefs. There are also a whole set of British converts now who mostly know only what the apostles have been teaching. So they're part of a new kind of a new connection that don't have local American ties. And of course, there's this inner core that are being taught kind of these orange secret practices at the heart. And then outside of headquarters, there's all these branches who are not really aware of a lot of these new developments. And so when Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram are assassinated, when they're martyred, June 27th, 1844, Hiram would have been the successor if Joseph Smith hadn't died alongside Joseph Smith. It set up a succession crisis that is the major moment of schism in the Latter-day Saint movement. It left us in 1844 with a number of succession alternatives, no clear successor. The most likely successor, the person with the best claim, was Sidney Rigdon, who is the last surviving member of the First Presidency. Other leaders of leadership councils are William Marks, who was president of the presiding High Council. So in other words, the headquarters High Council that is in charge of everywhere there's an organized stake, Nauvoo and all the other stakes. And then Brigham Young, who's president of the traveling High Council, the Apostles, who are in charge of mission field, all the branches, anywhere where there's not headquarters, not a stake. In addition to that, the church has always been led by a member of the Smith family. There have been a lot of talk about lineage. There have been, for example, offices that are passed by lineage, the presiding patriarch, evangelist of the church. And so William Smith, as the last surviving adult member of the Smith family, has a claim. In addition to that, we've talked about how there is this body, the Council of 50. Many of these guys, Sidney Rigdon, Brigham Young, William Marks, are all members of the Council of 50 who've been, again, be part of this new restoration of a kingdom. But the 50 is ordered not by the same kind of, it's ordered by age seniority. So the oldest members of the church actually are more senior. And so Lyman White and Alphaeus Cutler are both older than William Marks and Brigham Young, and so are more senior members of the Council of 50, and they have certain views that they have been given special jobs or positions by in terms of being their membership or senior membership in the Council of 50. One of the issues is that one of the very few things that is said at all about succession in the church's Book of Doctrine and Covenants is that if Joseph Smith should fall, then he'll have no power save it be to appoint another in his stead. And so that seems to be a verse or a scriptural support for a successor. At different times, Joseph Smith had designated, for example, his son, Joseph III, as a successor on multiple occasions. But the problem is he's just a teenage boy at the time. Previously, he'd also designated David Whitmer, one of the three witnesses of the Book of Mormon and the former president of the church in Missouri, as a successor. But David Whitmer is subsequently broke with Joseph Smith and is not part of the church. And then finally, there ends up a very unlikely succession alternative, but who ends up being a very strong contender in James Strang, who points out that the only way you can really be ordained to be a prophet is the same way Joseph Smith was, by having an angel do it, and he claims that an angel did appoint him to be the prophet, and so forth. So for headquarters, everything kind of comes down to a showdown in August 8th, 1844. So Emma Smith, the widow of Joseph Smith, would like for William Marks, the president of the presiding High Council, to assume a leadership role of the church. William Marks, however, believes that the person with the best claim is Sidney Rigdon, because he is the only surviving member of the First Presidency now that Joseph and Hiram are killed. Meanwhile, however, because Emma, William Marks, and Sidney Rigdon are all opponents of polygamy, for those core leaders in Nauvoo who have been practicing polygamy, they do not want to see William Marks or Sidney Rigdon in charge, or Emma especially, or anybody like that, because of their entire, let's say, family network. Everything that they've been doing would be called into question. And so they would prefer, obviously, to see a polygamist be made the successor. And indeed, the leader emerges from that group, Brigham Young, the president of the Traveling High Council, the 12 Apostles, also has the support of this group of British converts who, again, are converted because of the missionary work of the 12 and their apparatus. And so the British converts in Nauvoo actually, unlike other members who theoretically, if this all goes south, can just go back to wherever they're from in Indiana or wherever, they have a family network. The British converts are they're really in this. They have already immigrated to this country, and this is where they are. And so, in some sense, the supporters of Brigham Young are actually a lot more motivated. And certainly, when the two give their speeches, Brigham Young easily wins and takes control of the headquarters apparatus. His argument is that Sidney Rigdon's argument was that he should be named guardian of the church. Brigham Young instead argued that the 12 should be made into the first presidency, and so the 12 as a quorum, the 12 apostles, would become the leaders of the church. But as soon as that happens, the very next day, Brigham Young, as president of the 12, is acting as the de facto president of the church at its headquarters in Nauvoo. Of course, the members and the branches, despite being the majority of the members of the church, of course, have no say and are not consulted. So even though this is sometimes seen as, we now think, okay, 98% of all of the people involved in the Latter-day Saint movement are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so it's always just, continued to be that church from the beginning until now, and there's just some split-offs and so forth. It's not actually the case, especially at this time in 1844, and it's certainly not a foregone conclusion. So when I showed this kind of chart that showed kind of how the church hierarchy had evolved already by 1835, well, each one of these people represents an actual living person. And as of 1847, it's only, all the ones that are darkened here have died from that 1835 hierarchy. All the ones in orange have joined with Brigham Young. The ones in gray have left Mormonism. And the ones in blue are part of a different faction. So, by no means here is even in the top leadership, of the early church, is everybody just continuing along and heading off to Utah or anything like that. Okay, so we talked about how the church was evolving from that blue New York church to this Secret Practices Church in orange in Nauvoo. And so once there is a succession crisis, once there are multiple groups, each group from 1844 down to the present has had to have different ways to understand this early period and to kind of envision what is the essence of the Latter-day Saint movement, what's the true Mormonism, what is the real restoration all about. And they've had three general strategies. Obviously it's more complicated than this, but these are models under which we maybe can understand it, which is purification, which is to say, we got to this place of crisis because we went wrong at some point or other. What we need to do is go back to the way things were before things went off the rails. Secondly, preservation. So a lot of folks have decided, well, where we got to in 1844, Joseph Smith had finished his work, he'd restored the kingdom, he'd done all the things. Now we've got to hold on to that and preserve that until presumably a literal second coming, which may not be too long, but in any event, we've got the fullness now. And then there's a third group or a third set of folks who said, no, the whole idea of this movement from start to now is one of continual change, continual revelation, innovation. We need to keep on that same path, prophetic path, and be moving forward, not backwards or not standing still. So in terms of the strategy of purification, a number of different examples. One of them is Warren Parrish, who's the leader of the Church of Christ in Kirtland after they kick Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon out of the church, and Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith flee to Missouri. They reorganize their church. They go back into the old name, as so often happens. The original name of the church in 1830 is Church of Christ. And so folks who purify the church tend to go back to that name. So Warren Parish's church is called the Church of Christ. Another example, Sidney Rigdon. So after he loses that showdown to Brigham Young, he moves back to Pennsylvania. He reorganizes his own church headquarters, and it doesn't take too long before he starts purifying the church. He goes back to, eventually it's called the Church of Christ. Likewise, David Whitmer, I mentioned him as a potential successor. He'd been one of the witnesses of the Book of Mormon. He'd been named by Joseph Smith as his successor. When he organizes his church, it also gets called Church of Christ. And so in all of these cases, they look back and they say, well, Joseph Smith obviously made some mistakes. He became a fallen prophet, let's say, when he instituted polygamy. So that was clearly a mistake. So, Sidney Rigdon was an anti-polygamist right from the start. When he started that bank in Kirtland, when he led Zion's camp, in other words, when the church took up arms in order to try to get the lands back in Missouri. When they changed the name of the church should have always been called Church of Christ. When he edited his Revelations, so when the original text of Revelations that were printed in the Book of Commandments are heavily edited to make the Revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants, where do those edits come from? They say when all of these extra priesthood offices happened, when that higher priesthood happened. And in some cases, even when he organized the church, David Whitmer sort of argued, we were doing pretty good before we even had a church. We had a church without any organization as a bunch of elders and so forth doing all these things. And so if only we could go back to the way things were at the beginning of Nauvoo, or back in Missouri, or in Kirtland, or back in New York, then we'd get back to the real essence of the restoration. And indeed, for David Whitmer's church, the Whitmerite church, they even went back to a practice where all of the members essentially had their own seer stones, like Joseph Smith's seer stones when he's translating the Book of Mormon and so forth. And so it becomes a real New York blue style early restoration, Mormonism. So, preservation, folks. So people who feel like Joseph has restored the fullness of the gospel, he's the prophet. Successors are really just guarding the flock until the second coming, when Joseph returns in glory at the right hand of Christ and so forth. So Brigham Young is certainly in this camp. He does change things a bit because he makes everything that had been a secret practice, he brings that to everybody's so that it's practiced throughout his entire faction of the church, his church. So everybody practices polygamy and so forth, and not just having it be a secret. He attempts a couple minor, not minor, but anyway, a couple doctrinal changes himself, which ultimately get uprooted by his successors. So things like the Adam God doctrine and blood atonement and so forth. Lyman Wight, likewise, who is a leader of that successful colony I talked about in Texas. He doesn't ever claim to be the leader of the church. His faction is simply a branch of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He continues to practice a high Nauvoo style Mormonism. So they have their own little endowment house, which they may even refer to as a temple. They're doing endowments, polygamy, and so forth. Nevertheless, Lyman Wight had been present on many of the occasions, or on several of the occasions, when Joseph Smith had prophesied that Joseph III would be a successor. And so Lyman Wight also believed that that was the case, that Joseph III would eventually emerge as the new leader. And when that started to happen, he started to immigrate back to the Midwest, but died along the way. And so most of his followers ended up joining into the reorganization, despite the fact that they had a very different practice than later Joseph III is interested in. Likewise, Alphaeus Cutler, who goes midway along the way on the pioneer trek out west, but stays in Iowa, decides that he has a special calling to evangelize Native Americans and so forth, and that he's going to just sit out and wait in essentially southwestern Iowa until the Second Coming happens, when he can just sail down the Missouri River to Jackson County, where the New Jerusalem is going to be built, and doesn't need to go out to Utah with Brigham Young. Innovations. So one of the ideas for lots of different people who had been members from 1830 to 1844 is that they liked being a part of a church that has direct revelation. So there was a hymn that was sung, "A church without a prophet is not a church for me." And for example, the Strangite missionaries would sing that to the Brighamites, since Brigham Young was not acting as a prophet. He was acting as the leader of the 12. And so all of these sorts of prophetic mantle things that James Strang was doing, new revelations, new scripture, new doctrines, those are very appealing to people who had been drawn into a church that was like that. Other examples of this include Charles Thompson, who also created a faction in Iowa that kind of fell apart because he had everybody consecrate all their property to him and absconded with it and so on. But another kind of self-proclaimed prophet, Joseph Morris, out in Utah, created a kind of a homegrown rival to, locally to the Brighamites, and ultimately he and his followers were massacred by them during this kind of a violent frontier of the Mormon Utah. So I made a bunch of charts that kind of show how each one of these major groups fit together. And so Sidney Rigdon, we mentioned, had probably the best claim after Hyrum Smith's death to be Joseph Smith's successor, but gets kicked out of Nauvoo, flees to Pittsburgh, where he reorganizes his church, and it unravels. Before it unravels, though, he's able to kind of gather other opponents to Brigham Young, so people who had previously had their own kind of schismatic groups within Mormonism. So William Law, who had created Reform Mormonism in Nauvoo, whose paper, the Nauvoo Expositor, was exposing different practices that Joseph Smith had introduced. And George Hinkle, who'd gotten scapegoated during the Missouri Mormon War, and so had gotten kind of kicked out of a church, kind of organized his own church in Iowa. They kind of started making overtures to join with Sidney Rigdon's church. But again, we can even say, having been outmaneuvered by Young, Rigdon's movement faltered as he kept doing this thing of peeling back layers of the Restoration onion. So at a certain point, Rigdon's organization had gone back to what he kind of had originally started with in Kirtland, where he tried to get everybody to go out to a farm and live together communally and share property and so on. That ended up in disaster, as it almost always does. And by 1847, his organization collapsed. But within the Rigdonite branch, by 1861, one of his followers, William Bickertonite, reorganized what's called the Church of Jesus Christ with 12 new apostles. So the Church of Jesus Christ continues today as an heir to kind of a Kirtland era understanding of the Restoration. They're very interesting. They have, when you go to a Church of Jesus Christ meeting, they do everything by the Spirit, so they don't have prepared talks, they don't have prepared order of worship and so on. Different people are called upon to come up and give a musical presentation or the prayer, or to give a talk on a particular topic and so forth, in a very kind of lively, spirit-led kind of movement. They're unique in the Restoration tradition because they aren't living in the shadow of either the LDS Church or Community of Christ. And so they're like their own little Restoration tradition church who's been hewn out of stone without hands and is rolling forth to take on the whole world. One of the things that's very interesting is they've now produced, and this is the only time so far this has happened, historian who's been trained and has a PhD and so forth, Daniel Stone, who's begun to do research into the movement, and he's published a really excellent biography of kind of the forgotten founder of the Church of Jesus Christ, or refounder, William Bickerton, which I heartily recommend. So that's kind of the Rigdonites. There's another group that's defunct where Sidney Rigdon kind of had a correspondence church with Stephen Post, who went off and created a branch in Iowa and later Canada, and Sidney Rigdon sort of authorizing his church and leading it from afar, but Sidney Rigdon is very unstable, even by the end and so forth. Meanwhile, like I say, the Church of Jesus Christ continues on. It's headquartered in Pennsylvania. The Strangite branch. So James Strang is, like I say, a very interesting and unexpected competitor here for the leadership in the succession crisis. In the Wisconsin Territory, he was a relatively new member, so he just baptized by Joseph Smith a few months before Joseph Smith's death. So he's not a Nauvoo insider, he's not on any leadership council, but he does claim two things that Brigham Young lacks. So he has a canonical legal claim to the succession, this idea that, you have to be, Joseph Smith needs to have appointed you as successor. And two, also, he claimed anyway, a divine calling via angelic ordination and also by exercising prophetic gifts, a prophetic mantle. So Strang claims that he was appointed as Smith's successor via a letter. And so this letter of appointment, as Strang presented it anyway, called upon Strang to build up a stake of Zion called Voree in the Wisconsin Territory, which becomes the new headquarters, or original headquarters anyway, of Strang's organization. Lots of people have pointed out that this letter is not written in Joseph Smith's handwriting, certainly, and not in the known handwriting of any of his secretaries, and the signature is not Joseph Smith's either. But in any event, there is a letter that is making a legal claim that Strang is the successor. But I think much more important to that is this ordination that occurs by being claimed that an angel has done this. So in other words, apostles can't ordain somebody to be the prophet because it's a higher rank in the hierarchy, and that's a compelling argument if you believe in angelic ordination in the first place. The other thing that happens, though, is that Strang starts doing all the same kind of things that Joseph Smith had been doing. So, for example, he uncovers new plates, and there are new witnesses to the plates, and he publishes translations to those. He creates a new church organization. There's a new headquarters stake. They lay out ground for a new temple to be built. He establishes a newspaper. Elders are sent out, and like I say, they're rivals to the 12. And so as a result, he actually rapidly gathers a bunch of Mormon leaders to his banner, including people like William Smith, initially the Whitmers, and so forth, a bunch of different folks who are insiders. But also following in Joseph Smith's path, eventually James Strang is likewise martyred by assassins. When that happened, Strang's followers were expelled from their homes and their very successful colony on Beaver Island by non-Mormon mobs. When that happened, while Strang is on his deathbed, he refuses to name a successor. And the majority of his church members ultimately end up joining with Joseph III in the 1860s, a few short years later when the reorganization occurs. So you can kind of see here from Strang, the main line following here of James Strang. Lorenzo Hickey is one of his leading apostles. Then a later follower, Wingfield Watson, and there is now still a current active group who the main leader is David Flanders, but it's a congregation that's back in Voree. Meanwhile, people who'd been involved with Strang include William Smith, whose Williamite group ends up being partially the origin for the Josephites, as we'll see. Also had been a member of the Strangs as the Thompsonites, so I talked about Charles Thompson and his group in Preparation, Iowa. Also very interesting, George Adams, the Adamsites. These guys actually make a bunch of prefabricated houses and move to Palestine, where they want to bring about the literal gathering of Israel. They move to Jaffa, Tel Aviv, and actually do have an impact of in terms of Zionism and so forth. They're the topic of the Mark Twain satire Innocents Abroad, and so it's kind of an interesting story. Most of those folks end up in the reorganization too. All right, so the largest group, led initially by the 12, but then in 1847 reorganized with a new first presidency led by Brigham Young and headquartered in the new colony of Salt Lake City. That reorganization breaks off the Cutlerites and the Whiteites, as we'll see. And this continues kind of the main line now of Utah Mormonism. I mentioned Joseph Morris, a rival prophet whose followers get massacred by the Brighamite militia. And there's also a would-be reform from kind of more left-leaning intellectuals led by William Godbey. That doesn't really end up going anywhere. But the major schism within Utah Mormonism occurs when Wilford Woodruff ends up, making the manifesto where he claims initially anyway that the church is going to abandon polygamy. And when that happens, that causes kind of the major schism as a number of groups believe that the church is going into disorder or disorganization or apostasy by abandoning a new and everlasting covenant, plural marriage, celestial marriage. And so they continue to practice these fundamental doctrines in private, ultimately organizing into a bunch of different churches, including, as we mentioned, groups like the Apostolic United Brethren, the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the FLDS Church, and then just other groups that are associated with those groups, the Kingston Group, the LeBaron groups, the Righteous Branch, which is associated with the AUB and so forth, Centennial Park. Among other schisms in more recently, or different kinds in the LDS tradition, one of the interesting ones is the Third Convention. So in Mexico, native Mormons broke with Utah leadership or American leadership for a while and organized kind of their own separate branch of the church, which ultimately merged back in when they reconciled. But I think that this kind of a schism is going to be a lot more likely as the different movement has expanded so much in the developing world, so all across Latin America, but also Africa and even South Asia and so forth. We'll probably see a lot more, let's say, indigenous churches that end up taking their own leadership in Africa and so on and going forward. There are also a number of, let's say, more recent turns to fundamentalism. And so we mentioned at the beginning of this when we were talking about Under the Banner of Heaven, the School of the Prophets led by Robert Crossfield. So like I say, that group temporarily had the Laffertys associated with it. And then there's other, again, more recent neo-fundamentalist groups like the True and Living Church of Jesus Christ of Saints of the Last Day in Manti, which was led by James Harmston. There have been a couple left-leaning groups that have temporarily broken away. So, for example, there was a church led by Antonio Feliz, who is called the Restoration Church of Jesus Christ, which was very pro-LGBT and consisted of a lot of gay members and so forth. There was also, more recently, as an interesting an interesting break within the LDS Church are the Snufferites, Denver Snuffer, and like-minded individuals, what are called now the Fellowships of the Remnants. These are folks that are not, it's not leftward, but it is people who are kind of anti-corporatization, anti-institutionalized. So as the mainline LDS Church has become ever more correlated and as control continues to be centralized within the Council of 12, and first presidency, lots of people are kind of feeling stifled, like it's simply anyway, everything's by rote and McDonald's and so forth, and they want instead to kind of feel individual gifts of the Spirit and so forth. So this has become kind of a very popular and recent, schismatic movement and new challenge within the Brighamite tradition. So, one of the things that's interesting, almost all these groups, like I say, kind of emerged after the 1844 schism. They all did, but they also are in some ways trapped by this. And so, we kind of mentioned how in order to make his claim, Brigham Young more or less said that, well, as the senior most apostle, that's more or less why he should be able to, why he takes over. There's nothing in the Doctrine and Covenants or anything that says that, but because that ends up being retroactively how Brigham Young is in charge, in the LDS tradition ever since, what ends up happening is when the president of the church dies, the first presidency is dissolved, and the senior most apostle becomes the next church president. And so in order to retroactively legitimize Brigham Young's succession, the result of that has been that the LDS church leaders just get older and older and older and older, and less and less and less dynamic, and so less able to have any kind of reform at all. Likewise, we mentioned how James Strang had claimed that he was succeeded because he'd been appointed by his predecessor and also ordained by angels. He also said that the apostles, he translated a new book of scripture called the Book of the Law of the Lord, which very clearly says that apostles have no right to ordain new prophets and so forth. And so when he dies without ordaining a successor, without anybody coming forward who claimed angelic ordination, the apostles in his church weren't authorized to make a successor. And so as a result, the Strangites have never had a successor and still don't to this day. For the Josephite tradition that we're going to get to here, the claim again was that Joseph Jr., the original Joseph Smith, appointed his son, Joseph III, as a successor. And there also gets to be this idea that the family, that it's important, the Smith family is important in the leadership. And so when Joseph III, in fact, after a long, long reign, whereas he is the prophet and president of the RLDS Church, when he appoints his successor, he again indicates that the most important thing is that he is appointing a successor, but he does pick his son, Fred M. Smith, and that becomes the practice all the way into the end of, almost the end of the 20th century. Okay, so we mentioned the Cutlerites. We'll just mention them a little bit more. So Alphaeus Cutler had been a senior member by virtue of his age on the Council of 50, and considered himself to be part of a special group of 7, which we don't really understand other than what he maybe said about it, which meant that at a certain point he was authorized to act individually. Nevertheless, when the reorganization happens, he is very old indeed, and most of his followers ends up joining the reorganization, including all of his own descendants, except for a group which flees to get away from the reorganization and goes to Minnesota. The reorganization finds them there and also converts a bunch more of them. Anyway, ultimately, they themselves relocate to Missouri, and there's just a handful left. The Church of Jesus Christ Cutlerite, their building and their compound is just a little bit south of the where the temple lot is. And they're very interesting to folks, despite the fact that there's so few of them, because they are the one group outside of the Brighamite tradition that preserve the Nauvoo era temple endowment. And so they do it, but they do it in person, in secret, and we don't know how it goes. And there's a lot of grad students that are camped out around them trying to find out more about them and all of their different practices. The Cutlerites are very interesting to people. One other of the branches that goes all the way back are the Hedrichites. They are especially became known because Granville Hedrick, a bunch of branches that exist in central Illinois. They decide that what's really important is to go back to Jackson County, Missouri, to reclaim the temple lot that had been set aside there by Joseph Smith at the beginning of the church, where the New Jerusalem was supposed to happen and so forth. And so they're the first people to go back to Jackson County and reclaim that temple lot. They then have a huge infusion after years of kind of falling into almost inactivity. They have a huge infusion from the RLDS church, which causes them to get a lot of new energy, and they decide they want to try to build a temple lot. They build a temple on the temple lot. They dig a big hole. They don't get any further, and they break into a bunch of different factions. The Temple Lot Church, of course, continues and it still owns that property. But there are several other groups like the Churches of Christ with the Elijah message. There's the very interesting example of Pauline Hancock, who led what's sometimes informally called the Basement Church. It's the first time a woman was the leader of a Latter-day Saint denomination. Pauline Hancock's church ended up being kind of a left-leaning church that did a bunch of interesting study. Their research led them as a church to decide that the Book of Mormon had no historical basis, and so they voted to remove it from their canon. They later decided similarly about all of kind of Joseph Smith's prophetic claims, and they ultimately decided to vote themselves out of existence. And so it's kind of an interesting example. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, a church led by a guy named Dan Gaiman has kind of rejected most restoration distinctives and instead has created a church, the Church of Israel, that has essentially become a white identity church, and as associated with other kinds of white racist church and so forth. Just in terms of the temple lot, this is the original plan for independence, and you can see the temple parcel in the light green. That's kind of a it's not like not quite a triangle, but anyway. And the original plat, if we take the star on the plat, represents the traditional temple spot, the first temple that they kind of set the cornerstones for. That's meant to be one of essentially a proposal of 24 temples. What they all would be for, we don't particularly know, but anyway, the idea that this would be a New Jerusalem, a city that's centered on temples. There was a second plat that reorients how those temples would work, but you can still see how the temples would kind of all be part of in this location of where this original temple parcel would be. And so this is now the way it actually is, using that same light green area as the actual original temple parcel. And you can see the Church of Christ temple lot in that central traditional area, but also the LDS Visitor Center, the Community of Christ Auditorium, and the Community of Christ Temple, all within that temple lot and temple precinct. So that's the Temple Lot Church and the associated churches, the Hedrickites. We mentioned a couple other branches that emerged at this time that no longer exist. So the Whiteites down in Texas, also the Whitmerite Church I was talking about. It lasted all the way up into the 1960s, but went extinct. And of course then the Church of the Reorganization, the new organization led by Joseph III when he finally came of age, and then gathered people, the Whiteites, Cutlerites, Strangites, Thompsonites, and so forth, into a new organization of the church, which ultimately now is known as Community of Christ. Community of Christ has had its own number of schisms. So we mentioned how a whole bunch of people left during the administration of Fred M. Smith. So, for example, following Daniel McGregor into that Hedrickite church, causing all that craziness to happen in the Temple Lot Church. At the same time, here in Canada, in Toronto, one of the leaders of the church in Toronto, R.C. Evans, who had been a member of the RLDS First Presidency, also left and took about half the congregation with him to form the Church of the Christian Brotherhood, which rejected a lot of restoration distinctives like the Book of Mormon and so forth, and Joseph Smith as a prophet, but nevertheless retained a lot of other RLDS doctrines and so forth. Ultimately, most of the members of that group who continued in the movement merged back in. to Community of Christ. So there's descendants still here with us. But of course, the major schismatic moment occurred in the 1980s when Community of Christ, when the RLDS Church ceased to discriminate in priesthood ordination on the basis of gender. And so several of the other groups, the Restoration branches, broke with the church in order to maintain priesthood as a male-only idea, including groups like the Remnant Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We don't need those slides. So I just want to, that was my kind of, I guess it's a thumbnail, and yet it did seem like it took a long time. So this is my attempt to kind of map the major branches of schism within Mormonism. It by no means is an exhaustive study, because there are at least 80 expressions today that are large enough to field their own congregational meeting on a Sunday, and there are hundreds more that may just be even, down to one guy who kind of thinks he's the one and only true church. Steve Shields has published the most exhaustive and up-to-date list in his book, The Divergent Paths of the Restoration, which is currently available as an ebook from Signature Books. And so I'm going to have a glass of water after all of that, and Leandro maybe will help us find out if there's any questions. Raymond Ortiz says, do you think Joseph Smith, if Joseph Smith hadn't been murdered, would the church have become very different from the way Brigham Young led it to be? Yes. So I think it would be very different indeed. So I think that for Joseph Smith not to be killed, he would have had to make deals with the non-Mormons and return to lawful behavior. So he would have had to end polygamy, and he would have had to scapegoat different members who were practicing it the way he'd scapegoated John C. Bennett. And so I think he would have scapegoated Brigham Young and kicked him out of the church and other people in Brigham Young's cohort. And he would have tried to make a deal with the folks in Illinois to, for example, stop abusing the Nauvoo Charter with misinterpretation about the writs of habeas corpus and so forth. And so if he'd been able to navigate that, which is very dubious, it was pretty much impossible by the time he destroyed the press. So he would have had to have done a lot of change of course. But if he'd done all that, then I think, yes, that would have made a very, very different course indeed. Even if he was able to just make enough peace that he'd have to leave, it does look like Joseph Smith was more keen on and likely to move to Texas than to Utah. And so if that is the case, and he did have to lead the church away and flee, the church might be the major area of Mormondom might now be the area next to the Rio Grande in southernmost Texas today, which would be a very different history than by any means. Bob Garrison says, in the early days of the church, any male in good standing was considered a priest. No. So the answer is actually priesthood was done very differently than it is in the contemporary LDS church. So in the LDS church, priesthood is male only. All boys from the age of 12 are made deacons, 14-year-olds are made teachers, 16-year-olds are made priests, and 18-year-olds, especially if they go on a mission, are made elders. Otherwise, they got to wait a little while and then become an elder. And then at an indeterminate age, you probably get made a high priest if you rise high enough in your profession or something like that. But in general, everybody in the Utah LDS Church who's male is made an elder at a certain point in their life. That is not the case in how it worked in the priesthood work in the early church. So children are not ordained to priesthood offices. Deacon is meant to be was an adult office, and so on. And not everybody's ordained. So you would be ordained to the different offices. So some adult men would be made priests, and some would be made deacons and teachers, and others would be elders and so forth. But lots of them might not be ordained at all. So Leon DeBerg says, I am now living just a few kilometers from the headquarters of the Church of Christ with the sealed book here in Florianopolis, Brazil. I didn't know you are. I didn't know you were there. Leon, how interesting. Mauricio Berger is a prophet. I'm curious whether you have looked at any of the schisms outside North America. So I did have but a couple on the charts. I, for example, had one that was a recent one that is from the LDS Church that's in Utah. But this is an interesting one, and I just didn't put it on the chart yet because it's pretty new, and I haven't known exactly where Mauricio Berger, what's his background. So in other words, where are we dropping him off of? Was he originally a member of the LDS Church, or was he originally a member? It seemed like they have a lot of connections with the Hedrikites, with the Tempelot Church. And so, Leon, you'll have to tell me, because I have not. I've heard about this particular, the sealed book, and so these additional plates, because we can tell that the plates are the diagrams that they've shown are based on the Hoffman forgery, and so therefore obviously not valid. But anyway, they're an interesting development that this has happened, and I don't know. Like I say, I'm anticipating that there's going to be a lot more groups like that, and actually already are several, I'm sure, in Africa and in Brazil and in other places where there's lots of members, where there'll be now indigenous leaders or local leaders who are taking charge. And so this is obviously one of the examples, and I want to put this into future charts when I know a little bit more about their background. I'll have to read about it I'm sure it's in Steve Shields' book too. Owen McGrandle says, I've come across a few members from the church here in the UK. They claim that the church has over 14 million members. Is this true? So this is the LDS church, and that is also established in the UK, the same way Community of Christ is. No, there are not over 14 million members there. The LDS church claims that it has 14 million members, but the number who are actually active or who actually consider themselves members are fewer than that. It's hard to say exactly how many. There's certainly millions, but not that many million. So JB asks, what exactly is the kingdom? Well, it's not entirely clear. So they were, I would say that it's a anticipation of a literal millennium. And so the kingdom is meant to be an actual, probably meant to be an actual theocratic government where they are replacing the secular government as ultimately the idea. The kingdom, for example, considered itself to be in secret a legitimate government and sent ambassadors to sent ambassadors to Imperial Russia and other places. No real kingdom actually listened to any of the ambassadors except for the Republic of Texas, because the Republic of Texas wasn't a real country either. And so they received the ambassadors from the kingdom and actually were prepared. Sam Houston was prepared to let Joseph Smith relocate to the dangerous border zone between most of Texas and Mexico, because Texas and Mexico had a very uneasy peace, and the Texans were trying to establish themselves as an actual independent republic and so forth. And so it was a pseudo state that was a secret. It was possibly treason. It was that had a king, which Joseph Smith, and that it was meant to eventually eliminate all other governments on the planet when Christ ruled literally and directly, from the new Jerusalem in Independence, Missouri. Leon Warnock says, is the Council of 50 related to our Council of 70? What is the definition of 70 and the significance of 70? No. So the Council of 50 is not related to the Council of 70. So the Council of 50 is the secret kingdom that's established in 1843, 1844. The councils of 70 are related to the additional disciples sent forth by Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. So in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus first sends forth the 12 disciples, the 12 apostles, to go and spread the good news and so forth. And then the next chapter in Luke, Jesus says, the field is ripe, all ready to be harvested, and the workers are few, therefore send out more people to go. And so he sends out 70 more apostles, and then this is where we get the idea of 70. It's actually probably an error in the King James manuscript, and an error in the manuscript tradition. It probably should be 72. So it should be 72 because that's a more magic number. Like 72 is 1/2 of 144, which is 12 times 12. And so probably what is really meant in the original Luke manuscript is 72 additional apostles. We talked about it about a month ago in our lecture on the historic apostles, that there weren't just 12 apostles. The 12 were a special group within a much larger number of apostles in the first century Christianities. And so 70 in the Restoration tradition sense is it's essentially 70 more, people who are additional apostles. So there's the 12, and then there's 70s who are, there's more than 70 of them in every tradition that has 70s. So anyway, we have more than 70 of them. But anyway, there's meant to be, the idea of it is the number comes from the Gospel of Luke, and it's not related at all to the Council of 50. Michaelian says, what would John say to the suggestion that Joseph Smith meant Mormonism to be exoterically orthodox, but esoterically panentheistic? What would I say to that? Well, I would say on the one hand, Joseph Smith wouldn't necessarily, certainly wouldn't have used those terms in either cases. But what I think that what Joseph Smith is doing is working with. He's got a very open mind. He's very willing to look at things and see things and legitimize them, co-opt them, and bring them into his understanding. And so he is attempting, initially to do a restoration like other restorations, which is to say, wanting to live Scripture and live on the model of Scripture. And so in that sense, it's initially wholly very orthodox, like you're kind of saying, and trying to be in tune with a very kind of literalistic understanding of Scripture. But nevertheless, he's also interested in all kinds of things that make their own kinds of ancient claims. And so when he's ultimately exposed to, for example, Freemasonry, which claims to have roots that go back to Solomon's temple, and he sees lots of functions within Freemasonry, like, for example, a need to be able to have oaths to keep things secret, but also rituals that are able to do different kinds of initiation and these kind of things. He sees the value of those, and so he more or less declares that Masonry has legitimacy that goes back to Solomon's temple, which it actually doesn't, and then he restores it, by changing it, co-opting it, and bringing it into his understanding, so that he can, which also then legitimizes it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that what I'm trying to say here is that rather than particularly operating by either a plan or by a big idea, I think that Joseph Smith has a toolkit that he uses when he encountered different things that he encountered, and sometimes that allowed him to it allowed him to bring some things in, and co-opt them, but also, continuously add to and change what he's doing in the middle of, even having already established things that are actually quite contradictory. So for example, this co-option of Freemasonry, when he starts his career with the Book of Mormon is very aggressively anti-Masonic, it's predicting actually that secret combinations like the Masons are actually going to be responsible for the destruction of the United States and bringing about the end of the world, Armageddon, and so forth. So it's kind of a full circle reversal by the end. Leonard Warnock says, the Adam God doctrine, will John define it? I know it, but it feels important to Mormon history, like Blood Atonement and the Mountain Meadows Massacre. So I find it to be very, very confusing, but the Adam God doctrine is one of the few things that Brigham Young, more or less, contented himself to the power and the wealth and control and so forth, and knew that he didn't have the kinds of, he wasn't beloved like Joseph Smith, and he didn't have the kinds of creative intellect where he would come up with stuff that people just immediately embraced and liked, like Joseph Smith did. But this is one of the few times that he actually tried his hand at promulgating and creating a doctrine, and the doctrine is essentially a further variation on Joseph Smith's late Nauvoo progression theology. So Joseph Smith announced that that there's not God, the Father, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit are not simply one God. They're definitely three distinct gods, and that specifically God the Father, is often referred to as Elohim, is not the omnipotent, omniscient one of Christian theology, but instead is eternally progressing, and that at some point in the past, Elohim was a mortal just like all of us, and had been a righteous person on a previous world that was just like Earth, where he had a mortal probation, and has progressed to the point where he is a god of his current caliber, but obviously is not God in the sense that Trinitarian Christians understand God. And so Brigham Young's variation on that is So when Elohim essentially created this world, and Adam and Eve move from the world closest to God, star Kolob or whatever, and come to Earth as the kind of first people in this planet, the additional variation for Brigham Young is kind of demanding that we just have to understand that Adam is our God and the God of our world and dispensation, and that's the only God that we have to know or worry about. And it's so how that exactly works and what that exactly means, I think, was never clear to lots of people who found this to be a weird doctrine. And so as soon as Brigham Young was dead, they tried to bury it with him. But so the question kind of I have is, what is he saying, that Adam is Elohim, or that Elohim is a god of a different world and Adam is essentially the god of our world? Or I'm not entirely clear on what Brigham Young was trying to get at there. I don't think it was very coherent or a very good idea, and I assume this is why. I guess it's still doctrine in some of the fundamentalist churches, but I understand why the mainline Brighamites decided to get rid of that. Robert Roberts asks, what is the origin of Smith's use of the word stake? And so stake is a really weird word for diocese. And so like what traditional Christian would call a diocese in the Restoration is called a stake. And so the origin of that is the metaphor of Zion as a tent. And so if we think of, Zion, which is the church, the kingdom, if we think of Zion as as a tabernacle that the children of Israel are running around with in the Exodus, which is to say the tent. Tabernacle means tent. So if there's a tabernacle which has a central post that's holding up the tent, then there's all these stakes that are being planted all around with ropes that are holding up the stakes are holding up the tent post of Zion. So a stake is just a word that's part of this metaphor for the tabernacle of Zion. And so each one of these geographical stakes is holding up that tent. That's the origin of that use of that word. Owen McRandall says, what's John's opinion of the roots of all this? What does he think was really going on? I don't know what you mean. Well, the roots of all what? So the roots of the whole movement? I mean, there was, I'm not sure. So I guess I would say that people at the time of Joseph Smith were in North America, had a bunch of questions. They're largely all Christians, but they are living in a new world where the new world is not they have a biblical worldview. The new world doesn't exist in the Bible. The new world is not known to the writers of the Bible. It's not part of the biblical worldview. For literalists who actually believe in a literal flood and this sort of thing, which many of them did, then they had to ask themselves, well, how did people get to the new world? How did animals get to the new world, and so forth? And so the additional restored revelation and scripture and so forth, answered those kind of questions and allowed Americans living on the frontier to try to live out scripture the way they read about it. And so it was very exciting for people to be part of a movement like that. Bob Garrison asks, how is Warren Jeffs able to lead the FLDS Church from prison? Do his followers really believe he'll get out of prison and return to him? I presume some of them do think that something's going to happen, presumably supernaturally, that'll allow him to return. It's impressive that he's been able to continue to be the leader. Obviously, there have been several groups that have broken away from the FLDS Church. So, for example, here in Canada, the Blackmore group doesn't follow Jeff's leadership, and there's several other groups that are no longer, let's say, in communion with him. But lots of the core folks are, and so he kind of communicates through. I presume from people visiting him and so forth, and so people continue to. Now they have a leader who they don't believe did all the things that he did, that he got convicted of, and they have doubled down on following him. So
he just narrowed down the question.
Yeah. And is that it? All right. Well, thank you so much for all.
There's an hour.
Okay, so you have to.
I just said Owen just narrowed down the question.
Owen said, okay. The claim to be visited by an angel, etc. The claim that he'll return after his death. Okay, so it depends on. So it depends in terms of the way that Joseph Smith being visited by an angel is presented in LDS movies is a very literalistic visitation and so forth. I don't think that so Joseph Smith allowed people to believe that that's what he meant when he's talking about being visited by an angel. But angelic visitation is something that's a spiritual experience that's done in vision and so forth. And so he could very well have believed that through his gifts as a seer, that he has been in contact with supernatural, with angels and other, actually with God, and he is inspired by who have inspired him with the various messages and so forth. So I think that it's completely possible for Joseph Smith to have believed in his own calling. He knows that he has not had any visitations, since there's no such thing as a visitation, but many of his followers have believed in visitations, and they portray it that way. But all of the different leaders who, for example, have claimed angelic visitations, and there's lots of them throughout those charts, know that in as much as that they themselves believe in that they have been inspired and received revelation, they know that is not coming via a visitation, just like all popes know that they are not being visited by Jesus in the flesh who's talking to them. It's a spiritual experience that is not that's not physical like that. Bob Garris, nice, we've already asked that.
That's it. What did you already answer?
Yeah. So Rain Weber says, could John compare the early schisms in Mormonism with that of Ali and Akbar after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in Islam? So yeah, so again, in Islam, just like with Joseph Smith, there wasn't really contemplated. Muhammad was the last prophet, and so when you're the last prophet, you can't have more prophets, and so it's so who's the successor after the last prophet is killed, and so who is going to be the successor, the caliph, and so that there's not a clear way of having a successor, and so the options kind of were after Muhammad's death are his main companions. Like Akbar, are they the people who are going to be leading the faithful and who are going to be the caliphs afterwards? Or is it maybe Muhammad's family? And so Muhammad doesn't have sons to lead, but he has favorite daughters and son-in-law, Ali. And so the idea is that maybe the successor of the caliph should be members of that dynasty. So Fatima's is the daughter, and so the dynasty that emerges that claims descent from her is the Fatimid dynasty, the Fatimids, who were the medieval caliphs of Egypt, for example. And so those two groups in Islam, the people who follow the companions or look to the companions as a leadership are the Sunnis, and the ones who look to the family are the Shiites. And so there's a direct parallel in the Mormon tradition too, which is is it going to be essentially, is the successor going to be Joseph Smith's companions, the apostles, Brigham Young and all of those folks, or is it going to be his family, so his son Joseph III? And so in that sense, again, the bigger group, the Sunnis, the Utah Mormons, the Brighamites, and so forth. The smaller group, the Josephites, or the Shiites, are the people who follow the family community of Christ. But that would be the rough comparison between the two. Andrew Maher says, I saw somewhere that there are millions of LDS members in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Kinshasa. Is that true? I doubt there's millions. I haven't heard that. There could be a lot of members there, but I haven't heard that as a main area of membership for the LDS. I mean, I know they have lots and lots of members in Brazil and Mexico, and they have had enough members in different African countries like Ghana, I think, to have temples. So there's probably several temples in that imply that there's a number of LDS members in Africa in different places, but I haven't heard millions in Congo. If that's true, that's new to me, and I haven't heard about that. Catherine Grandjean says, was polygamy encouraged or allowed due to the overabundance of women? No. So that's not the reason for it. So polygamy is established in Nauvoo. There's not an abundance of women. There's this normal amount women in Nauvoo, and it's not because there's too many widows or there's too few husbands or anything like that. It's simply something that's presumably, as Joseph Smith is thinking about a restoration of all things, one of the things that he's thinking about is the Old Testament practice of polygamy. So, what King David is doing, as he's thinking of himself in the role of King David and being a king like King David, and so forth, but also the patriarchs, so Abraham and so forth. That's one of the things that in secret gets restored. But even though, for example, there are lots more women, for example, when you get to Utah, there's a lot more women than there are, for example, in any other kind of Wild West town around there. So normally on the American frontier, the proportion of women is very tiny compared to all of the miners and cowboys and so forth. It's just a normal number of women in Utah. So you don't need to have you didn't need to have polygamy in terms of any gender imbalance. It just creates a gender imbalance when you do it. So what ends up happening is marrying age for women goes way down. So just girls get married to, in some cases, the marrying age for men goes way up. So functionally, you no longer have a partnership of equals. You have instead an aging patriarch whose relationship with these girls that he's marrying is generationally different as a result of that. So this is one of the reasons why Canada, for example, considers religious polygamy to be polygyny. Is just to say, multiple women religiously marrying just a man to be against the Human Rights Charter. So. All right. Well, very good. I hope that was fun, and I'm going to I've only seen the first episode so far of Under the Banner of Heaven, so we're going to maybe go and watch the second one. So anyway, it's been interesting so far, and so hopefully this kind of gives you a good outline for how the Latter-day Saint movement fits together.